I'm a researcher with the Private Equity Stakeholder Project. And today we released a report that gives an overview of private equity investments in education, looking all the way from early childhood education through for-profit higher education. And for the report release, we wanted to put together a group of people that could speak a little bit more in depth about how private equity and private capital more broadly affects students, families, and communities. So I'll get started with my presentation and then introduce each of the panelists before their presentation. I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen. So I wanted to kind of talk briefly about trends that we're seeing in private equity investments in education. So in 2021, private equity firms completed a record number of deals in the education sector, which has been following a trend of increases each year since 2007, actually. But you can see like almost 150 deals were made last year, and this is kind of strictly in private equity, so not even counting like venture capital investments. And $14 billion were exchanged in these deals. So not only are the number of deals increasing, but the size of the deals are increasing too as private equity firms consolidate companies. So private equity firms will use words like fragmented to describe the sector, kind of signaling their interest in consolidating the market to make bigger and better assets to sell down the line. Private equity firms make their money by buying a company, employing strategies to increase its value, and selling it some years later. In industries like retail, private equity firms can increase value through cost-cutting measures like mass layoffs or store closures. But in sectors like education, private equity firms mostly increase value through mergers and acquisitions. And of course, this is presented as beneficial for students. So firms will suggest that a bigger company means more resources for more students, but there's very little evidence that these private equity owned companies actually produce better outcomes for students. So I wanted to use one of the case studies in the report as an example of how private equity firms are looking to control larger portions of the market and how that plays out for school districts and for students. Oops. Okay. So Veritas Capital is a technology-focused private equity firm whose companies mostly service US government entities at the federal, state, and local levels. So most of the companies that you see here, this is their current portfolio. The kind of contracts that they get are mostly funded by taxpayer dollars. Because of these government contracts, Veritas Capital owns companies that interact with millions and millions of US residents. Their investments include Cubic, which is the company that runs the New York City Metro fare payment system, and Peraton, which is a military contractor that is building the biometric database for the Department of Homeland Security. So Veritas Capital just had its 30th anniversary this year, but it just started investing in education in 2018 when it took Cambium Learning Group private for $900 million. At the time of the acquisition, Cambium's programs and curricula included reading, math, science, social studies, and elective courses that were offered to school districts. But then in 2020, Cambium acquired the assessment division of American Institutes for Research, which is a nonprofit that had been responsible for administering 60 million standardized tests across 25 states. With this portfolio acquisition, Cambium created a new unit called Cambium Assessment, which, quote, brings together advanced K-12 assessment services with research-based individualized instruction, which helps the company to provide, quote, an end-to-end portfolio of solutions. Now, these are Cambium's own words about what they're doing, but school districts are beginning to take up some of this language too. So part of my research for this report was looking at contracts that companies like Cambium had with state and local agencies. In July of this year, the Public School Board of Hillsborough County in Florida approved a contract with Cambium for its Language Live program, which offers personalized language and reading instruction online. The district needed a new intensive reading program for grades 6 through 10, and Language Live came with an extra perk. So they justified the contract by saying, next year, students will be taking Florida's Assessment of Student Thinking developed by Cambium, the parent company of Language Live. This means that there will be a seamless connection between required assessment and instruction. So Cambium, backed by Veritas Capital, has created this this kind of through line that like districts can get curriculum and assessment from the company, and also the company is developing and administering the standardized testing at the end of the year. So we can see through this example how private equity makes itself the logical choice, right? So if they're going to create the test, they might as well create the curriculum. Cambium creates the test in 26 states and the US Virgin Islands, and in the remaining states, they act as a subcontractor for College Board, administering the SAT and other college entrance exams to high school students. So you can see through this kind of interactive map that every state Cambium operates in administering standardized testing. For some of them, we don't know exactly how much they make from administering these tests because they're not kind of the direct contractor, they're a subcontractor of College Board. But in other states, they, like Texas and Florida, they contract directly with the state to provide statewide standardized testing. So we arrive at a point where Cambium has contracts with 94% of school districts. And I wanted to use this example because I think it's a good example of what's happening across all of the issue areas that we're going to talk about today, how private equity tries to make itself the logical choice by taking over a larger share of the market, either at no benefit to or even at the expense of students. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and we can hear from other panelists. So our next panelist is Hugh Grant Chapman. He's a first-year Master of Public Policy candidate at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. He previously served as Research and Communications Associate at the Center for Democracy and Technology, where he worked to promote equitable use of data and technology in education and other civic institutions through research and external engagement. Hugh's work at CDT has been informed by prior privacy and data governance experience from working at a healthcare data analytics company and interning as a software developer at other data analytics startups. He also completed a Fulbright grant in Kinmen, Taiwan, where he taught English to a small public elementary school. Hugh, ready?
Awesome. Thanks so much, Azani, and thank you all for coming and being a part of this conversation. I'm going to try to share my screen here. All right, I think that should be going. So I'm going to talk a little bit about why protecting student privacy is important and how we can work towards ensuring responsible use of education technology. Education technology adoption has grown rapidly in K-12 schools across the US in the past few years. Education technology can look like a number of different things. It can be classroom management software, education content delivery software, communications tools or learning management systems, as well as assessment and proctoring tools. I think we really saw the use of this explode during the pandemic and the rise of remote learning, which I think kind of maps well to that chart, Azani, that you showed kind of at the beginning, that these are really becoming, playing a very large role in students' educational experiences. I think some of these tools can offer potential benefits, possibly, but they also introduce a lot of really important risks that need to be thoughtfully managed. The framing that I kind of like to use is that it's essential that if we're going to use education technology, that we need to ensure that the benefits of these tools are realized for all students equitably. And at the same time, there are no groups of students that bear a disproportionate amount of the risk that they generate. One of the main points of my part of this presentation is that a framework for responsible education technology use requires a multifaceted approach. I kind of give 4 buckets here of student privacy, cybersecurity, digital equity, and online safety. These are not necessarily like the only 4 buckets, but I think there are 4 that are salient. They are really interconnected, and it is essential to kind of look at them holistically when figuring out how to use education technology responsibly in schools across the US. Often what we've seen is that schools and other education agencies will implement new technology from private vendors first, and then only after words, consider some of these responsible use principles once it's already part of it. And this really exacerbates the risks that some of these tools are going to have harmful impacts. Instead, what we should be doing is kind of centering these responsible use principles at the outset, when even beginning to consider how to use some of these technologies and sort of designing that into the process. I'm going to be talking a little bit about one case study for why a lot of these principles are really important and how the current education system is falling short in providing protections. And this is about student activity monitoring. I'm just gonna, I guess I'll just start by like reading this definition here. So student activity monitoring is a kind of technology that is used by schools or districts to track student activity online, including by monitoring internet search queries, browsing behavior, the contents of students' emails or chats or documents, as well as real-time contents of student screen. The way it works is that a school or district will contract with a private company that provides this kind of software, and the company will conduct its monitoring service and generate flags that it then sends to the school for certain kinds of student activity. The specifics of what kind of flags are generated and how this operates is dependent upon how the student activity monitoring software is configured. But this illustrates kind of the breadth of some of what is possible here. We're seeing that the use of student activity monitoring software is extremely widespread in the US and is increasing. As of summer of 2022, 89% of surveyed middle and high school teachers report that their school is using some kind of student activity monitoring. It's not hard to see how these tools have the potential to be really invasive into students' lives. And this combined with that like really widespread use that we're seeing really kind of elevated my concern and some of my colleagues. So when I worked at the Center for Democracy and Technology before I started school, I was one of the main authors of a series of reports on the use of this software and their impacts on students' educational experiences and overall well-being. So I'm going to go over kind of a range of findings from some recent survey research that we did. So this was all conducted summer of 2022, and we've done a couple of follow-up things after. So I'm going to go through these quick. One, we're seeing that this monitoring software is being used for disciplinary measures more often than for student safety. This is in contrast to what a lot of vendors will say to like market their product. It'll say, you know, hey, this is useful for directing student mental health resources to students who need it, or to flag potentially dangerous behavior in students before you know, something bad happens. That's kind of the pitch, but instead what we're seeing is that it's much more common for this to be used to discipline students. You know, 78% of teachers say that the software has been used in their school to flag a student for disciplinary policy. Two, teachers are bearing a large amount of the responsibility for managing this kind of software, but they're lacking training. Almost half of teachers whose school uses this kind of software report that they receive alerts from it at least once a week, and 70% report receiving them daily. This is a huge burden on teachers, but we see that like less than 1/3 of teachers report, this is not on screen, but less than one teachers report that they've received training on how to use this kind of software. Three, we've seen that this kind of monitoring is often not limited to school hours. It will be, you know, active after hours or even on the weekends for like a full 24/7 kind of tracking and surveillance. Only 45% of teachers, less than half, report that the monitoring software is limited to when school is actually in session. Four, stakeholders, and by that I mean students' families and students themselves, as well as a lot of teachers, indicate major knowledge gaps in how this monitoring software actually works, and what are the potential implications. We then saw really a wide range of very troubling impacts that this kind of software is producing in students today. So I'm going to run through these. I'm going to go through these quick, but I'm happy to circle back at any point because there's kind of a lot going on here. One, students are at increased risk of interactions with law enforcement, A full 44% of teachers that we surveyed report that they know a student that's been contacted by law enforcement as a result of behaviors that have been flagged through student activity monitoring. This is extremely troubling and is bringing law enforcement in to situations that really raise concerns that they're going to do more harm than good. We found that LGBTQ plus students are being disproportionately targeted for action. One form of this targeting is a full 29% of LGBTQ plus students report that they or someone they know has had their gender identity or sexual orientation involuntarily disclosed either to school staff or to their parents or other students through the use of this kind of software. In addition to this, LGBTQ plus students report being more likely than other students to be flagged for a wide range of different activities through student activity monitoring software, which includes receiving disciplinary action and law enforcement contact. Extremely troubling suggestion that there is disparate impact of this kind of technology. We found evidence that students' mental health can suffer from the use of this, specifically kind of intersections of self-censorship and inability to express true thoughts online out of a fear of surveillance. We also found that students from low-income families, Black students and Hispanic students are also at greater risk of harm. The main mechanism that we saw here, and this was actually the primary focus of a report that we did the previous year, 2021, which looks at the link between reliance on school-issued devices, laptops and tablets, and over surveillance because those devices are more likely to become preloaded with this kind of monitoring software. We found that Black, Hispanic, and lower-income students are more likely to be reliant on school-issued devices and therefore at greater risk of being over-surveilled. And then last, we see that student activity monitoring is posing disproportionate risk to students with disabilities. Similar to LGBTQ plus students, we saw that students with disabilities are being flagged at much higher rates than other students for a range of activity, including for law enforcement contact, which is extremely troubling. These are some really disturbing findings, and they really evidence kind of one case study of what happens when student privacy and digital equity and cybersecurity, online safety are not kept at the foreground of decisions about what kind of technology to use, who to contract with as vendors, and really what their practices are. So I have a couple of recommendations here. A lot of our recommendations that we drafted are sort of focused on at the school and district level, but we also have some kind of more directed at like state and federal level. I'm going to keep this quick because I'm coming in on time, but it's essential to have transparent and robust community engagement with members of the school community to get their input on what kinds of technology should be used and not to keep them in the dark. This includes building digital literacy to understand how some of these tools operate. It's important to train teachers and other school staff on what kind of technology is in place and how can it be configured to avoid risk to student privacy and other irresponsible tech uses. Schools should utilize procurement and data governance decisions that have a process in place for vetting potential tech that they onboard for potential privacy impacts and other inevitable impacts. And a couple other, these disparate impacts should be monitored for proactively, and technology decisions should be grounded in sound pedagogy and evidence-based practices, which is something that I didn't mention earlier, but a big part of our concern for student activity monitoring is that there is not a lot of evidence to back the claims that of the benefits that it says, in addition to all those harms that we just went through. I'll pause there because I'm going over time, but happy to talk more about this afterwards.
Thanks so much. That was really great, really, really important work. Thanks so much. I'm going to introduce Sarah. So Sarah Jimenez is a senior researcher with Community Labor United and lead organizer for the Care That Works Coalition, a multiracial feminist labor and community coalition fighting for an empowered, community-based childcare workforce and an equitable childcare future in Greater Boston and Massachusetts. Since the coalition's formation in 2017, Sarah has provided the research for key initiatives such as strengthening childcare requirements in Boston's zoning code, launching the pilot to organize early hour childcare for low-income BIPOC parents in Boston to access unionized construction careers, and launching a campaign to organize family, friend, and neighbor caregivers to fight for greater recognition and resources in Massachusetts. Sarah?
Great. Thank you, Izani. Thank you, PESP. It's really great to be here and to see so many folks tuning in to, get the dirt on private equity players in our communities. So with that, I'll just launch in a little bit more background about Community Labor United and Care That Works. My organization, CLU, was formed over 15 years ago to build a movement between labor and community groups. And the primary way we do this is by convening coalitions of unions and community groups around issues of shared interest. And childcare is one of those issues. So we started organizing our partners around childcare back in 2015 to 2017. And that was a while ago. So over the years, we've had different reasons to dig into low-road childcare corporations, whether for-profit or nonprofit. For example, looking at specific employers that affect the workers in our coalition, looking at corporations that we see proposing public-private partnerships in our state, and then also just trying to gain a better understanding of larger trends in the childcare industry, particularly as federal and state policy moves closer towards expanding our childcare system, which then, of course, introduces the danger of low-road corporations exploiting those well-intentioned public resources. So I don't have any slides today, but I'll do my best to keep you all on track. Mostly, I love lists, so I'm just going to use the list format here. I'll talk about 4 general issues that we have seen on the worksite level, and then 3 issues sort of more on the industry or the community level. So on the worksite level, of course, one of the biggest impacts of low-road childcare models is, labor is one of the greatest expenses in the childcare business model, and so therefore a lot of the cost-cutting measures that employers try to use affect workers. So wages and benefits are obviously on top on the list. This is a low-wage industry in general. In Massachusetts, the median wage for childcare workers is $13 an hour, in contrast to 26 for all workers. Unionized centers across the country actually earn a little bit more, about like $1.50 an hour more, but still not that much. When we looked at Bright Horizons specifically, they are a publicly traded company, not private equity, but that's only because they reached the end game of private equity investment, which is the cash out that they get by taking the company public. So for Bright Horizons in 2020, the median salary for workers was $20,000. CEO Stephen Kramer took in $2.9 million. So the average worker would have to work about 140 years to earn what the CEO did. So these are poverty jobs. Most caregivers rely on public assistance to get by. Another cost-cutting measure is seen in insufficient staffing ratios and staffing levels. So management may not be providing enough teachers overall for the center, enough teachers for particular classrooms, enough float teachers to be able to, reallocate staff capacity as needed. And this is exacerbated by the increase in children, especially over the pandemic, who need, have been struggling at home and need additional support and attention, and therefore actually need lower staffing ratios. But management doesn't respond with additional teachers. So the impact for teachers, of course, is that they're overworked, they're overscheduled, they face burnout. They can't take bathroom breaks, during their day. And then, of course, for the children and teachers, those ratios can sometimes be even unsafe. And so teachers are set up to fail in a way where, where there might inevitably be some kind of an accident or an incident that is due to the high staffing ratios, but then the teacher themselves gets blamed for the outcome. All of this, leads to high staffing turnover levels. So for-profit centers have the highest turnover rates in the industry. And so, from a profit standpoint, higher turnover actually in some ways is that maybe even a good thing, right? So you kind of keep paying low wages to entry workers as they come in and fill those empty slots. And then also, I think you probably are deterring organizing from happening by having high turnover rates. But of course, high turnover rates are indicating that these are very bad quality jobs that teachers aren't, that the educators are not happy to keep. And for the children, the impact is they experience this rotating cast of caregivers. in a context where the quality of that relationship is really what drives the quality of care. And so finally, in our state, for the fourth impact at the worksite level, of course, is, a high degree of interest in union busting. So in our state, we have a handful of maybe a couple dozen centers that are organized, but they're all basically not-for-profit or public. There are basically no for-profit centers where workers are rep by a union. Bright Horizons, which has 700 locations in North America, has one location that is unionized. That one is in New York. And they've had, I think, more than a dozen NLRB cases in the last decade. So real quick, I'm going to jump to my list of just phenomena at the industry and community level. Of course, we've observed, a lot. We're really interested in what their strategies for expansion and competition are within the industry. I learned from PESP's report that for-profit franchises and chains in childcare operate 4.1% of centers. That actually surprised me. I would have guessed more. That said, what my impression is that private equity interest in childcare is maybe somewhat recent, but definitely growing, with the exception of Bright Horizons and Bain Capital that were ahead of the game. For example, Learning Care Group, when many other chains small centers had to close over the pandemic, since COVID, they've actually been able to open 80 new locations in the US. So we see that private equity firms really like to buy existing centers. And we've even discovered specialized brokerage firms that facilitate the sale of small centers, as well as related firms that specialize in coaching small business owners how to improve their business, how to open more sites, and then eventually how to cash in by selling their whole chain to a private equity firm. We also see for-profits that have the employer contract model. They aren't shy about displacing small centers that hold existing contracts. And in some cases, this has led to some pretty active local organizing efforts of parents who are trying to stop Bright Horizons from coming in and replacing the center that their children were utilizing. And we've seen that happen, for example, at universities like Tufts, Cornell, UC Santa Cruz, and UC Berkeley. We are, of course, trying to track their lobbying efforts. You've read about the Early Care and Education Consortium in the report. I love the graph on the spending on lobbying. And so, their mission statement as a lobby group says that they aim to pass policies to, quote, bring quality to scale. And so we've really keyed in on this as part of their strategy to delegitimize home-based childcare, family friend and neighbor care. So even though quality is not correlated with setting, they somehow managed to give everyone the impression that only centers can be quality care, and therefore drive more business at centers, and of course, therefore, reduce support for an investment in home-based childcare, which is predominantly a women of color-owned industry. Small businesses, right, embedded in communities. So I think the last piece that I'll just talk about, I know we're coming on time here, is we've also seen how their messaging around quality has created another profit-making opportunity in an auxiliary sector, specifically quality consulting services. So we were tracking, for example, how this need for quality in center and classroom-based settings has led to the creation of a new kind of organization, early childhood support organizations, which then can advocate for public funding to be given to them in order to purportedly raise the quality of centers. And here in Massachusetts, for example, they were able to get about $20 million recently for a contract to just kind of do a proof of concept. So we aren't actively working on center-based organizing right now because we haven't yet determined which union in our state will take lead on organizing. But it is a really fertile industry for union to union solidarity because of that direct connection between parents and caregivers. So as large employers with unionized workforces start to offer childcare benefits, or as unions start to organize benefits for their members, I think one question we're really interested in understanding is how can they leverage that power to support, worker organizing efforts within childcare centers, and then bargain for the common good. So I'll just close by saying, the highly privatized nature of childcare has always been a problem, but the stakes are much higher now that universal childcare is on the table at the federal and the state level. And I think it's going to take all of us working together to make sure that this doesn't become yet another exploited public sector. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks so much, Sarah. Lots of really good information. I am going to move to our final panelist, Jeff Bryant, who is the Chief Correspondent and Writing Fellow for Our Schools, a project of the Independent Media Institute. He's a communications consultant, freelance writer, advocacy journalist, and director of the Education Opportunity Network, a strategy and messaging center for progressive education policy. His award-winning commentary and reporting routinely appear in prominent online news outlets, and he speaks frequently at national events about public education policy. Jeff?
Thanks for that nice introduction. Thanks for holding this important discussion, and thank you for producing such a wonderful report. I hope people who are on this call click through and read it and download it and share it. I've been writing about the privatization movement in public schools for 12 years, but in the area of private equity, I've written primarily about two specific focuses. One is private equity's involvement in for-profit charter schools. The other area I've delved into is private equity's involvement in the outsourcing of mental health services from school districts to for-profit firms. Today, I'm just going to talk about the charter school area in particular, because that's what's featured in the report. Specifically, I've reported about a chain of charter schools called ACCEL, A-C-C-E-L. It is a large nationwide chain of charter schools. I think they're up to nearly 80 schools. They're all for-profit run. The firm is backed, the financial backer of that firm is let me see if I've suddenly lost the name. Safanad Limited, which is based in Dubai. Safanad, previous to delving into the charter school industry, delved into the private senior living facilities industry. And they have a very troubled record there. And now they appear to be bringing that troubled record into charter schools, which is highly problematic. But I want to talk a little bit also about why it's important to focus on private equity and rather than just for-profit entities in general. I think there's been plenty of research done on the problems posed by for-profit investors and companies moving into public services. I think it's uniformly been found that for-profit businesses that run public services lower the quality of services and programs, while they tend to raise the cost to the public. Just think about that, lowering the quality of the service while raising the cost to the public. That's really not a very good result. But it's especially important to look at private equity involvement, because private equity involvement is basically for-profit involvement on steroids. A study by an NYU private equity for-profit ownership project found that for-profit ownership is really different from private equity for-profit ownership is really different from generic for-profit ownership, because private equity ownership confers distinct incentives to quickly and substantially increase the value of their portfolio firms. It is a form of very intense, high-powered for-profit management, and the authors asserted that this characterizes the private equity and could lead to detrimental implications for consumer welfare. So the for-profit that are backed by private equity are especially misaligned with the common good. And in this case, this can have devastating effects on schools. ACCEL Schools, which I mentioned, which is featured in the report. What their mode of operation has been is to gobble up charter schools that are either defunct or near defunct and kind of retrofit them and bring them back into the market. In Ohio, most of the charter schools that ACCEL bought up were run by a for-profit management company called White Hat. White Hat was getting into a lot of trouble because parents were leaving the low-quality schools. The Ohio school rating system that the state runs had graded most of their schools with D or F ratings. And White Hat was also getting into a lot of legal trouble over conflicts of interest. So for many reasons, White Hat was leaving the market. Accel was there ready to gobble up many of those schools. In the Cleveland area, for instance, the results haven't been an improvement. Many of the Cleveland charter schools run by White Hat were D and F rated. Since Accel has taken them over, the 16 schools, 3 are C rated. There are no A or B rated schools, and the 11 others are all D and F rated schools. So this hasn't been of any benefit really to the school children of Cleveland. Since I did that research and wrote that report, I was contacted by whistleblowers from Accel charter schools throughout Ohio. And they told me stories of what was the impact of Accel taking over their school. And the impacts were quite troubling. For instance, one of the first things Accel would do was they would strip down resources and facilities to the bare bones. For instance, teachers would come to the school and find that there was nothing on the walls of the school. There's no decoration. The schools were unkempt. The janitorial services were very poor. One teacher told me that one day when a student came to her classroom because he hurt his hand, she went to the first aid kit in the office and it was completely empty. She had to go out and buy Band-Aids with her own personal money. And ever since then, all the students would come to her for Band-Aids and other first aid equipment. The other thing that always happens when Accel takes over schools is that the curriculum and program offerings are reduced to the bare minimum. In these schools that the whistleblowers were telling me about, there were no textbooks. Maybe there would be a set or two that were held in the library, but they always had to be returned at the end of class. Most students were told to spend at least 30 minutes per class period on their Chromebooks, looking at a software platform. There were very few learning materials in the schools. The libraries were mostly stripped bare. The program offerings like after-school services, many oftentimes were cut. And then there were very few things outside of the core curriculum that were available to children. Things like band, things like drama. And so the school is also stripped down to just the most essential tasks. The instructional emphases of the school also changed. Instead of being like a well-rounded school experience, often the schools tended to focus mostly just on test prep, trying to get the kids through the tests that are required by state and federal law. Students would spend inordinate amounts of time on their Chromebooks doing test prep, and then there would be rallies or special events for the classes to compete against each other. Oftentimes, pizza parties would be thrown in as incentives. Another feature that was true of the Accel schools is that teacher turnover always increased after Accel took over. The emphasis was on pushing young teachers through the school and churning them through the system as quickly as possible. This keeps wages low. It also keeps, unfortunately, instructional levels low quality. Oftentimes, there would not be support staff available who could, for instance, help out with English language services or special education. By law, those have to be featured, but they would often be stripped down to such the bare bones that there would be one special education specialist for the entire school. Outsourcing of services also increases when Accel takes over a school. Accel has a number of associated companies that work with schools. They have their own real estate firm. They have their own tech service. They have their own professional development service. And lots of times the school would outsource instead of to what had been available to teachers. They outsource it to the Accel entities. So the money is basically just still churning through Accel. And school operations and governance became less transparent whenever Accel took over a school. The board members who operate the school are generally handpicked by Accel. And what they report about the school governance tends to be very minimal. Board meetings, for instance, are generally posted. Results and meeting notes and things like that are often not shared on social media or in any kind of visible way. Teachers or other school staff who complain about the lack of direction in the school or the lack of materials are often told, well, we'll get back to you on that. And oftentimes, at least it was told to me, that doesn't happen. So the result here is that in a charter application of the business model, struggling schools are cycled through a series of private entities, with Cell just being one of them. Prior to that, of course, it was White Hat. Who knows will be the next one. And in turn, each of those private entities strip the school of resources, run them at bare bones costs, and reap whatever assets that remain, usually the real estate, before handing the school off to the next private operator or shutting them down completely. And in business and investment circles, this model is often defended as an important economic function to either revive struggling businesses or reallocate resources, property that have invested in failed enterprises to more productive endeavors. But in the case of charter schools, practicing this form of high equity for-profit business model, although the business consequence might be fine for the charter operators and their investors, the children caught up in this investor-driven enterprise often have their education significantly disrupted or even permanently impaired, perhaps with lifelong impact. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Jeff. Thanks to all of our panelists for speaking today. And we can go ahead and kick off the question and answer portion of the webinar. We have about 15 minutes. And I saw one question in the chat, which I'll read out to you all. Are there any suggestions for a counter argument for privatizers that say that bare bones is all schools should be? No sports, extracurriculars, etc. Just focus on core subjects. We have a school board candidate running here who literally wrote a book on it. Maybe Jeff, if you have ideas about this.
Yeah, I think that's a myth, a complete myth. It's a common one that we just need the basics. We need schools to do the basics. But most research shows that what kids really benefit from is a well-rounded approach. For instance, learning music actually has been linked to progress in math achievement. So also students get multiple psychological and sociological and physical and mental development things out of attending school. It's where they spend so much of their time. It's where they make their first friends. It's where they have their first oftentimes encounters with students who aren't with people who are diverse from them, different from them. So it's really, I think, a minimalist and really mythological idea that we just need to do the basics. And if we do that, kids will do better.
Thank you. We have another question in the chat. So what can or should unions do to fight back? Maybe Sarah, do you want to start?
Sorry, this is going to be a super obvious answer, I think, but the first one that came to mind, organize, of course. I think, the union density in the for-profit childcare sector, as I said, is very, very low. And, they followed, I think, a similar playbook to other corporations, right, in avoiding unionization at all costs. But this is such a great moment in the labor movement, right? Like we're seeing a surge of organizing in so many different sectors. And honestly, I think the power that childcare workers have in particular is a lot higher than I think they even realize right now, potentially, after so many decades of not having any power, because the way that the labor market is that there are so many jobs, employers are trying to fill them, and so many people can't go to work without care. Wages are rising, so all these care jobs are looking even worse and worse by comparison. So the number one problem for big childcare centers is that they can't staff their centers, right, to fill them up to capacity. So the effect of a strike, for example, right, would be devastating. And so yeah, I mean the number one thing, of course, for unions always, right, is organizing.
Thank you.
Actually, sorry, Azani, I'm just going to add one more thing, which is I alluded to this a little bit in my answer too, but I am really interested in like what are the opportunities for union to union solidarity in this moment. Again, because and here in Massachusetts, I've heard a lot of larger unions say that they are starting to fight for childcare benefits in their contracts, or they are interested in trying to organize childcare members directly themselves for their members, childcare benefits for their members. And so, right, like, are there opportunities, right, like the power of a big contract economically, for example, or even just the power of taking a stand in solidarity? What are the tactics that are possible in trying to support and encourage organizing, and also to put centers on notice, center chains on notice that the labor movement is going to hold together on this.
Thank you. Folks can continue to add questions in the Q&A or in the chat. But I'm wondering if each of you can talk a little bit more about like any successful interventions that you've seen. Hugh, I know you talked about kind of like more thoroughly vetting companies. I wonder if any districts or any like local or state governments have like put policies in place for that kind of work. Sarah, if you've seen any kind of organizing already happening, or like what the organizing process at those nonprofits might have looked like. And then Jeff, if you've come across any kind of like effective counter organizing in terms of these private equity firms buying up charter schools. Maybe we can start with Hugh.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, it's a great question. And I think one thing that didn't quite get to the end of mine is that I think there's a big role here for potential increase of state leadership, of kind of states stepping up and setting models. One state that at CGT we've worked with a lot and has been a really good model is Connecticut. What they've done there is have their Department of Education has set up a leadership team that compiles a big list of different ed tech vendors and companies that they have like done this like vetting work on for like impacts on like privacy, impacts on like cybersecurity, those kind of things that I was talking about, and has kind of done that work in a centralized place, and then made that available, not just made it available, but like really encouraged, maybe even required the schools and districts in Connecticut to go through that and to make sure that, if you're gonna, onboard a new technology, either you can choose one that's pre-approved from this list, or if not, then you gotta like really kind of go through a petition process as a way to, help safeguard. Because I don't think that it should be the responsibility of like every different school to go and like take on this big burden of like decrypting what exactly is like the impact of this technology. What are the interests involved that I'm maybe not seeing. But states, I think, can really play a leadership role in helping schools with that really big task in a centralized and streamlined way. And I'm happy to share some links of some success stories if that's helpful.
Yeah, that would be great. Thanks. Sarah?
Sure. Can you remind me your prompt, Asani?
Just kind of like successful, if you've seen any successful interventions. I know you said there's not really hasn't been successful organizing at the for-profit centers, but maybe if there's any lessons from kind of the nonprofit workers that have organized that could carry over.
Sure. Well, I do think that we should try to learn, and we should do this as well, because we haven't actually reached out to these folks, but we should try to learn from, I think it's UFT Local 2 that did organize that Bright Horizons location in Brooklyn, New York. And what I understand from part of the story is that they did it because the parents, right, got very involved, right, recognizing how low the wages were of the staff at the center. So I think similar to successful stories in public education, right? I do think that community and labor coming together, right, parents and providers coming together and creating that united front is really essential to successful organizing. On a different level, I would say, that's sort of in the fight against realm, right? Like in pushing back against low road corporations. I think there's also a really big fight for that our coalition is actually a little bit more engaged in right now, which is trying to drive investment in and support for home-based childcare, right? We are ultimately, we do need a mixed delivery system with all the different settings and forms of care. But I think it will take some extra effort to support the home-based sector against what I talked about, the efforts of private equity to actually even delegitimize home-based care. So in our state, right, in a variety of different ways, we've been working really hard to raise the profile of home-based childcare providers, organize them, and then fight for greater resources and recognition. And so, right, just to maintain at least, right, like to keep them from backsliding, and ideally even growing.
Thank you. Jeff, do you have any examples? Oh, you're muted.
I don't have any examples that are specific to resistance to private equity involvement in charters, because that's a subject that's really flying under the radar right now. Not too many people know about it, but there are loads of successful examples of resistance to charter schools opening in communities. And this goes back to kind of building on what Sarah's comments were that resistance to charter schools is a natural coalition builder between labor and parents, between business entities in the community, because especially in towns that have real estate values that are in critical condition, usually anything that worsens the quality of the local public schools affects the real estate business. In a number of communities, the private school system is the #1 employer. So anything that harms the public education system it is felt widespread in the community. And we're seeing this right now, particularly in Tennessee. Tennessee is fairly new to the charter school industry game. But the governor there, Bill Lee, is a huge fan. He wants to, initially he wanted 100, now he wants 50 new charter schools opening up across the states, operated by a private religious-based college in Michigan. Everywhere that they've tried to open a school so far, at least that I'm aware of, there's been huge resistance from all corners of the community, including the school board that school boards that have so far, at least that I know of, rejected every attempt. Now, the problem is you've got a situation in Tennessee where there's a higher entity that's appointed by the governor that kind of has the last say. So that's a whole other obstacle to leap. But I think at local levels, resistance to charters are numerous and offer numerous ways to build coalitions that can endure.
Thank you. We have just a few minutes left. Let me see. We have a question. I'm interested to know if legislation for the elimination of seat time is on your radar. It gives the ability for students to receive instruction outside of the school walls without union teachers. This privatization method relies on assessment embedded in EdTech to provide evidence that the student learned the content outside of school. This is not something that I looked at in the report, and so I'm not sure about any legislation around this. Has anyone else heard of anything about this?
Yeah, I can speak to it somewhat in a general way, because I've seen it. I've seen a lot of movement afoot, not so much legislation, but definitely proposals for micro credentials. The terminology it varies from place to place. Course choice, where they break down the program that the school offers, so students can opt into, well, I'll do the English course, but I won't do history here, or I'll do it online or something like that. There have been various proposals out there for some time, and it absolutely is a loophole for increased privatization, because those options frequently are outsourced and have generally free rein to act on their own. But I think it's not on the radar in most communities, but it's something that's coming up, and I'm glad that somebody out there asked the question. It's important.
Thank you. We have another question about public pension fund investments and private equity firms that are involved in education. So are there significant public pension fund investments? Yes, there are. I think a lot of public pension funds and also some union pension funds are invested in private equity firms that are invested in education technology or some of these other services that are provided to schools through private equity firms. I think that there are some kind of groups that might be represented on this call that have like thought about that and thought about like kind of looking through investments to see where maybe we could like apply some leverage. But I think, yeah, it's really difficult for public pension funds and union pension funds to know actually what they're invested in, especially since the way the private equity works, you have to kind of commit the money before the companies are purchased, right? And you don't really get very much of a say usually. So yeah, I would be happy to talk more about that and kind of think about any strategies for using that to students' advantage. Let's see. I think those are all the questions we have. Do any of the panelists want to give a final word or have anything else to add? All right, thank you so much. For everyone who attended the report, the webinar, we'll be sending out a link to the report. And yeah, thank you so much. And we'll send out also the contact information for the panelists in case you're interested in connecting with any of the work that they're doing. Really, really amazing, impactful work being done by folks on this call. So thank you all so much for attending.
Thank you.